We read the last chapter, the conclusion of this great book by Paul LeBlanc for tonight. And I'm going to kind of summarize it. Basically, stick with it, kind of a summary with a few comments here and there. But I want to start with by saying, like, why this topic now? Like, why are we talking about Leninism? Well, first of all, we talk about it all the time. But secondly, because the revolutionary socialist left is in kind of a disastrous, fractured state, and some people have come to question some of our former comrades in our former organization have come to question some Leninist basics. And oh, good, Jim. Yeah, you're here. And obviously, we always support questioning, but wanted to reaffirm some things and also reaffirm some questions and critiques. The title "Leninism Reassessed" comes from a great piece by Duncan Hallis called "Trotskyism Reassessed," which is more critical, and I'm going to be probably less critical here, but wanted to borrow that title. The book is by Paul LeBlanc. Paul LeBlanc is a longtime revolutionary socialist from Socialist Workers' Party days, International Socialist Organization, Fourth International. Could everybody mute if you're not, well, I'm speaking, so you're not speaking. Let's see. So yeah, Paul LeBlanc, and he's about the nicest guy ever. He's written a lot of great stuff that I recommend engaging with. Unfinished Leninism, a lot about Leninism and Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky and Luxemburg. He has, when our organization fell apart, he went over into the DSA and into the Burning Campaign, and is now with Tempest, which is one of those organizations that is, considering these questions now. So, all right. So in this conclusion, the concluding chapter of this book, LeBlanc starts off by talking about discipline and the discipline necessary to make a proletarian revolution. I don't really like this word discipline here, but he says that without certain conditions, that discipline becomes mere phrase mongering and clowning. But the conditions that need to exist are: one, class consciousness and devotion to revolution of significant elements of the working class, the vanguard. Two, the ability of the vanguard to link up with the broad mass of the class, integrated into the life and experiences of working class and oppressed people. And three, the correctness of the vanguard's leadership and the recognition of it by the broad masses. And he says that a correct revolutionary theory, not dogma, assumes final shape only in connection with the practical activity of a mass revolutionary movement. He makes note that the vanguard cannot proclaim itself, but must prove itself through prolonged effort and hard-won experience. And then early in this chapter, he outlines Lenin's vision of revolutionary organization. He says, we're not talking about a self-righteous authoritarian sect, but a principled, determined, open, evolving, efficient, creative, self-controlled, and with self-initiative. The revolutionary organization should illuminate paths for successful struggles and be true to revolutionary theory and capable of developing it and defining it and producing it and advancing theory. He says it should be neither a loose federation of radical circles nor a monolithic entity. but then he also says it should be a cohesive whole with a variety of critical-minded activists. And let's see, then he starts to talk about democratic centralism, which the sort of shorthand for democratic centralism is democracy in discussion, centralism in action. So, ideally, everyone gets a chance to present their views and fight for them, and then we make a decision as an organization, and then even the people that whose views didn't win out focus on executing the winning proposal, and then we reassess, right? So we're not super democratic centralists, to be honest, because we're like a loose, very small group, and but LeBlanc outlines how the Bolsheviks and the RSDLP before them, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, displayed great flexibility in the application of democratic centralism, starting from study circles and activist committees in the 1890s, and going through to through the successful revolution. And he says that only in Lenin's final years do contradictions crop up in the Leninist perspective, and these flowed from problems inherent in the desperate Russian conditions, not from any authoritarian problematic in their organizational concepts. So, all right, so he's then he gets into George Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist, who said that the Leninist Party is the tangible embodiment of proletarian class consciousness. And Lukács says the party's role is to foresee the trajectory of the objective economic forces and to forecast what the appropriate action of the working class must be, to prepare the proletarian masses intellectually, materially, and organizationally. And then LeBlanc cites Ernest Mandel. He talks about him quite a bit in this chapter and throughout the book, who was a Belgian Marxist economist from the Fourth International. And Mandel says there are three underlying components of the Leninist theory of organization. One, a theory of the actuality of revolution. So in other words, this is not a mere theory. We want to make it real. Two, a theory of the discontinuous and contradictory development of class consciousness, of proletarian class consciousness. And regarding this, he says that objective conditions play a crucial but not an exclusive role. So objective conditions are sort of like what's out there, what we can't control. Whereas the subjective element can also play a factor, the subjective element being the organized intervention of conscious revolutionaries, which is what we want to be. And then the third underlying component is a theory of Marxism and its relationship to science and class struggle. Then LeBlanc cites, talks about Rosa Levine-Meyer, some of her thoughts on this. And Levine-Meyer was a Polish-German socialist revolutionary turned Bolshevik back in the Russian revolutionary days. And she said, the leader must be some steps ahead of the people. And this demands a broad outlook, the ability to draw historical parallels, and a thorough acquaintance with world affairs, both past and present. Lenin demanded knowledge of the essential events of history and public life of every party member. As to the leaders, he insisted that to beat their counterparts, in other words, the people that we're arguing against, that we're struggling against other political tendencies, to beat their counterparts, they must absorb not only political and economic knowledge, but the existing bourgeois culture as well. They can qualify for their role only by making politics their profession to the exclusion of any other striving. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I may not have too many other strivings anymore, but I got a lot of other shit I have to do. Let's see, revolutionary organization cannot cleverly stand aloof from struggle. Struggle is how the masses become aware of their interests. We must give a positive answer to the problem, where do we go from here? We must be a step in front of the masses, but only one step, Levine Meyer says, but only one step in front, so that it always remains a leader of their struggle. So, you know, we don't want to be too far out ahead and not connected to genuine mass struggle. And then she also insists on the need for theoretical clarity that culminates in the concrete analysis of a concrete situation. And then LeBlanc brings up James Cannon, who was a US Trotskyist from the Socialist Workers' Party. And Cannon said the conscious socialists should act as a leaven in the instinctive and spontaneous movement of the working class. The leaven can help the dough rise and eventually become a loaf of bread, but it can never be a loaf of bread by itself. So Ben was just bringing up this metaphor, I think yesterday. More on democratic centralism. He kind of goes back to this. And he cites Mandel again and says that centralization is not an organizational, or should not be interpreted in the organizational or administrative sense, but in the political sense. The centralization, what we want is the centralization of experience, knowledge, and conclusions drawn out of actual militancy. To have those live in one organization and broadcast to as many other people as we can is really important because there's no other way to learn. And then Mandel also, or I'm not sure if this is Mandel, it's probably just LeBlanc. He says mistakes are unavoidable. The key for a revolutionary is not in avoiding mistakes, but how they go about correcting them. And then he talks about Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, and said that the Bolsheviks, Gramsci pointed out that the Bolsheviks became the leading party of Russia via a 30-year selection process that involved a struggle of factions and small groups, splits and mergers and all that. That process required, according to Gramsci, quote, not despairing even when all seemed lost, but starting again patiently and tenaciously. And, you know, I feel that because, you know, a couple of years ago, our organization collapsed and we've had to figure out how to continue, you know, on a modest scale, patiently and tenaciously. So, and then back to James Cannon, who said that the fate of every political group, whether it is to live and grow or degenerate and die, is decided in its first experiences by the way in which it answers two decisive questions: the adoption of a correct political program and the nature of its activities, what tasks it shall set itself, given the size and capacity of the group, the period of the development of the class struggle, the relations of forces in the political movement. So basically theory and practice, or politics and strategy, perhaps. Cannon said, if the group misunderstands the tasks set for it by the conditions of the day, if it does not know how to answer the most important of all questions in politics, that is, the question of what to do next, then the group, no matter what its merits otherwise, can wear itself out in misdirected efforts and futile activities and come to grief. And this is a point that we've been making a lot in our arguments within the RSN. I want to go outside of the chapter for to cite yet another Marxist named Mick Armstrong, who's a current contemporary revolutionary with us in Australia. And he said, it's very important to be clear on the distinction between a propaganda group and a mass party. In particular, that propaganda groups do not have the capacity to lead workers in major struggles and to recruit on that basis. They must rely primarily on their general socialist ideas. While we can play an important role in initiating some localized struggles and provide some of the key activists in a variety of campaign groups, we are as yet too small to have any serious impact on the major struggles that break out. We can only recruit handfuls of people, not move the masses. One of the reasons why so many revolutionary groups came to grief, he uses the same phrase, which I assume he's sort of referencing Cannon, is that they overestimated their own capacities and greatly exaggerated their ability to influence struggles or campaigns. They often spurned the conception of being a propaganda group and tried to act as agitational groups. The only people fooled by this are the socialists themselves, who mistrain their members to believe that they are genuinely engaged in agitation. Two things, and sorry, I should have defined propaganda and agitation. I'd like to kind of save it for the discussion at this point. So Mick goes on to say, two things are required to establish a working class base. First, a critical mass of revolutionaries, not tens, but some hundreds or thousands. Secondly, a generalized ferment within the working class, not just a wave of strikes, but a broad social rebellion. Without these preconditions, any attempt to go to the working class will break the neck of the revolutionaries. So the next section of this chapter is called Problems of Leninism. And some of those problems that LeBlanc cites are the potential for sectarian arrogance and elitism, the degeneration into a sect that isolates itself from living social struggles. He talks about Rosa Luxemburg's critiques of Leninism and says that they're most effective if they're incorporated into a Leninist framework, which I love. Sort of absorb the criticism and and keep it popping. And then he also says many critiques are just completely worthless. The ones that come from anti-communists and academics that are not involved in trying to change the world. And he also talks about how democracy can be undermined by centralism. And let's see, this might be the last new name in the chapter that I'm going to cite, at least. Sheila Rowbotham. She was a British, or perhaps is, I'm not sure, a British socialist feminist historian from the International Socialists and the British SWP. And she brings up how revolutionaries can face a split loyalty between a commitment to an autonomous group and the Leninist organization. So, as revolutionaries, we sort of consider, well, in our case, like the Denver Communists to be our home base, and then we do a lot of other activism, and we might be, participating in a coalition. We might be working with, some single issue groups, that kind of thing. So that's that. That split loyalty can come up. And she says, we need to have some level of party discipline, but we also need to develop the self-activity of others. Regarding the problems that Rowbotham ascribes to democratic centralism, LeBlanc says the elitism, arrogance, hierarchy, bureaucratism, the mind trips, insensitivity, and so on that Rowbotham attributes to Leninism can also be found throughout our society, including in trade unions, feminist organizations, peace organizations, and political parties and groups with impeccably non-Leninist credentials. So in other words, you can't pin that on Leninism, those problems. Robotham says that we need to have a willingness to trust as well as to criticize what we have done. It's very important. And then she says that socialist ideas can be pre-Leninist or anti-Leninist, but there is no clear post-Leninist revolutionary tradition yet. Leninism is still alive, whatever dogmatic accoutrements it has acquired. And then LeBlanc says, well, obviously we got to lose those dogmatic accoutrements. But I also want to point out that Robotham's quote there seems to be a reference to the Sartre idea. Jean-Paul Sartre said, a so-called going beyond Marxism will at worst only be a return to pre-Marxism, and at best only the rediscovery of a thought already contained in the philosophy that one believes he has gone beyond. And we see this all the time, and I think that this is very much in play right now in this political moment in our kind of milieu. This idea that we need something new, we need something different, and generally it's their attempts at shortcuts that end up sending us back to the beginning. So then coming around the bend here, y'all. Then LeBlanc talks about Leninism in the US, the history of it.
He does.
And he talks about the CPUSA, Communist Party USA, and says that it zigzagged from ultra-leftism to reformism under the influence of Stalinism, that it organized workers, or that it has organized workers politically, not as socialists, but as the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party. And then he talks a little bit about the SWP and various Maoist groups like the SDS and the RCP. SDS, actually, the Students for a Democratic Society. Paul LeBlanc was a member of that back in the 60s. He's old as shit. And then the Revolutionary and by the way, like I think Maoists are trying to revive SDS around the country now. And then the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, which still exists, is super weird. Let's see, and then he talks about the DSA, and says that many drifted, he's talking about like in the 80s. He says that many drifted into reformism after concluding that Leninism is not appropriate for current US conditions. And this is a thought that remains, prominent among leftists now, socialists now. And he talks about how new left radicals that consciously rejected old left ideologies ended up gravitating to the two dominant old left ideologies, social democracy and Stalinism. And we still see that. LeBlanc said Lenin was convinced that a coming together of socialist ideas and the working class was possible and necessary, that it would transform each and create a force capable of bringing about revolutionary change, but that a serious, democratic, and cohesive organization guided by a critical-minded and revolutionary Marxism was necessary to accomplish this. And he sort of paints like the need for an American variant or US variant of Leninism. And it says it's needed, and that variant must include, one, an understanding of the Bolshevik experience, two, an understanding of revolutionary movements since the 1920s, three, an analysis of recent developments in the world capitalist system, and four, a critical-minded shaping of organizational norms and political functioning in light of 1, 2, and 3. And then let's see, he cites Mandel again and says, the only right you claim for yourself as revolutionaries, inside the unions, inside the mass parties, inside the Soviets, and I want to add inside social movements, is to be a more dedicated, a more courageous, a more lucid, a more self-denying builder of the mass parties, builder of the Soviets, builder of the social movements, the unions, and a defender of the general interests of the working class, without attributing to yourself any special privilege with regard to your fellow workers, except the right to try to convince them. And then he sort of concludes by saying, we have nothing to teach if we are not continually learning from the past, from the present, and from outside our group, and by critically absorbing and utilizing revolutionary theory. So that's all I got. And yeah, I guess we can open it up to discussion. Thanks, comrades.